I would like to invite you to join me on a white sand beach in the Philippines, bordered by a vibrant and thriving coral reef. There's a young marine scientist standing there, salt water dripping from her wetsuit. She's holding a snorkel, a pair of cooking tongs, and a 6-gallon bucket tied to her waist. She's performing an unusual pantomime to a confused but patient group of fishermen. She's trying to explain that the crown of thorns starfish, which the fishermen had just collected hundreds of, is a stress spawner. This means that handling them too roughly, whether prying them off the reef with the cooking tongs or tossing them into the buckets, can ironically lead to even more of these overpopulated, reef-eating starfish. Why? Because stress causes them to release more eggs, worsening the problem. Apologies if this isn't the tranquil beach scene you were expecting. Before I invited you, I probably should have mentioned that on this particular white sand beach in the Philippines, there's also a pit filled with 1,500 dead starfish, a young marine scientist enacting obscene charades in an attempt to save the coral reef, and alongside her, a group of traditional fishermen, the star fishermen, who have unexpectedly become the reef's most pivotal allies. You're probably curious about why I organized a starfish Armageddon. Let me explain. The crown of thorns starfish is native to the reefs of the Indo-Pacific, but in the absence of predators, their populations explode, and soon the whole reef is decorated in these inedible, spiny, poisonous sea stars. To make things worse, there's only one predator who will eat them in their adult phase: the Triton snail, a massive gastropod with an ornate shell that has been almost completely eliminated from coral reefs to be sold as souvenirs for tourists. Okay, but since one has too many starfish, been such a bad thing? Well, the crown of thorns isn't like the friendly little starfish in the aquarium touch tank. They eat reef-building corals, and they are voracious. A single crown of thorns can eat a patch of coral up to the area of a dinner plate in one day, and we collected tens of thousands of them. Addressing the crown of thorns starfish invasion is a temporary solution to keeping our coral reefs intact, an ecological band-aid. If we want corals to survive the climate crisis, we need to eliminate overfishing, halt unsustainable fishing practices like using dynamite and cyanide, and we need to reduce physical damage to reefs from anchoring and pollution. It may sound like two different things, ecosystem imbalance and climate change, but think of it this way. Just as a poor diet and lack of exercise compromise our health, making us more susceptible to disease, similarly, an unhealthy reef weakened by pollution or ecosystem imbalance can make corals more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And corals are seriously in trouble. In the next 25 years, we could lose almost all of our coral reefs. Since 2009, we have witnessed a progressive loss of about 14% of the world's corals. We could lose coral reefs within our lifetimes. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns that we stand to lose a vast majority of our corals with just 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, and virtually all at 2 degrees. Just this year, we saw the hottest ocean temperatures on record. Despite covering less than 1% of the ocean's floor, coral reefs harbor a quarter of all marine species. They support fisheries that provide protein to millions of people worldwide, and they shelter our coastlines from the devastating impacts of storms. But I can say that in my short lifetime, I have seen more dead reefs than living ones. What would a world without coral reefs look like? And how could we let that happen? These questions aren't rhetorical. They're a call to action. Though the situation is dire, it's not without hope. Coral reefs have an incredible ability to recover if we let them. And the only people who know this better than the scientists are the fisherfolk. Understanding ecological decline through the eyes of those most affected, the fisherfolk, reveals not just challenges, but solutions rooted in centuries of traditional knowledge. And nobody understands the consequences of losing coral reefs more than the fishing community that collected 20,000 starfish. We didn't have the resources to hire a whole team of professional divers with fancy equipment, but we were able to muster a dedicated community of fishermen. They have boats, they're exceptionally skilled freedivers, and they have the most incentive to protect the reefs like their lives depend on it, because more than anyone, they do. It was a privilege to spend my mornings with these fishermen. As I watched them dive, effortlessly holding their breath for minutes, navigating coral crevices, and skillfully gathering starfish, I saw more than their expertise. I witnessed their instinctive connection with the sea. I realized that this is their life work. Their vocation is to hunt and to be in the ocean. They knew the name of every species. They drove their boats better than they could walk on land. And as I watched them dance with the underwater world, I realized what's really at stake. If their reefs die, they're not just losing an ecosystem, they're losing a way of life. I have had hundreds of conversations with fishermen and women around the world, and I always ask the same questions in my surveys. Are you proud of your identity as a fisher? Do you hope your children follow in your footsteps? Was your father or grandfather a fisher? And what I've gathered and inferred from their responses is that fishing affirms a sense of place, identity, and purpose. Fishers love fishing. They often view it as a part of who they are. Not only is it their livelihood, but it's their heritage and their connection to nature. But fishers are often the martyrs of ecological decline. It's easy to blame them for overfishing. More and more small-scale fishers are chasing less and less fish. A common solution to protecting coral reefs is to ban fishing or place stringent regulations on fishers who are already struggling to make ends meet. But what we've often failed to consider is that these men and women could hold the keys to the survival of coral reefs if we listen and learn rather than sideline them. My surveys don't normally stop after the last question on the data sheet. I'll often have hour-long conversations, sitting beneath banana trees or dangling our legs off a boat. And what I've realized is that these men and women know more about coral reef, seagrass, and mangrove ecosystems than I could ever learn in an advanced degree in marine science. We know that to protect ecosystems and species, we have to understand them first, to know what we're saving. Scientists and conservationists are often put in charge of protecting places because, well, we've studied it. We're experts. But we overlook our best resources. It's time we integrate fisherfolk knowledge into our conservation strategies. Let me give you an example. In 2022, I was living on a remote field station in Belize, conducting a study on illegal fishing in a marine protected area that I had helped to create. I interviewed the local fishers, and I listened to the perspectives of those who I thought to be responsible for the loss of protected species from this beautiful marine reserve. I thought that my results would indicate that we need to increase regulations or strengthen enforcement. But after speaking to hundreds of kind, compassionate, and environmentally aware fishers, my perspective completely changed. I found that the demographic most likely to be caught fishing illegally was the group with the lowest social mobility, the highest resource dependency, and on average, lived closest to the poverty line. Protecting our coral reefs is not about punishing people trying to make a living. It's about creating accommodating conditions that allow people to fish sustainably while providing pathways for people to rise out of poverty. My work with the star fishermen showed me how deeply connected these communities are to their reefs. But the Belizean fishermen taught me that if we want to protect our marine ecosystems, we first have to protect the people who depend on them. This is interesting. A similar study in Kenya found that you could predict with relatively high certainty what type of fishing gear a person uses based on the type of floor they have in their homes. Wealthier fishers can afford concrete floors, while poorer fishers often lived on dirt. They found that the poorest fishers were the most likely to fish with unsustainable gear. This study highlights the direct link between socioeconomic status and fishing practices. By making coral reef conservation more inclusive, we can change fishing practices and ultimately have a positive impact on our coral reefs. So, what if we first focused on human development? What if we built up the capacity of women in fishing villages, focused on education, healthcare, and quality of life? Can we change the way that people interact with the marine environment? Can we decrease necessary dependence on marine resources if we make people's lives better first? Conservation is most effective when we work with the people who rely directly on the ecosystem. So instead of kicking people out, why don't we invite them to become stewards of their resources, like the star fishermen, who went on to become honorary marine scientists? They now work for the local government, conducting studies to monitor crown of thorns outbreaks, instead of fishing on an overfished reef. There are plenty of other examples of ways where we can create equitable solutions to preserving nature, but I'll leave you with a few of my favorites. One option is that we can invite fishers to become sea ranchers through sustainable aquaculture, where with the right resources and support, they can manage, tend to, and even repopulate species that have been depleted in the wild. We can also invite fishers to become marine managers or park rangers. The Bantay Dagat are fisher folk turned enforcement officers in the marine reserves of the Philippines. They understand how other fishers fish, they know the reef like the back of their hands, and they get to make a good living protecting their coral reefs. Aside from creating culturally affirming, meaningful work for fishing communities, we can also simply take their ideas into consideration when protecting coral reefs. For example, when marine protected areas were created in Kenya, they did not work. Fisher folk didn't resonate with the idea of a marine protected area. So some fishers suggested they rename them to Tengefus, which means to set aside in Kiswahili. And it worked. Swahili fishers culturally understand the importance of saving something for later. We can also learn a lot about conservation by understanding the traditional practices of fishing communities. Pacific Island nations have spiritually managed their coral reefs for millennia through fisheries closures called taboos, which is actually where we got the word to explain socially questionable activities. Taboos temporarily close an area of a reef to fishing, to provide for feasts or festivals, or to honor the death of an elder. It would be taboo to fish in a spiritually significant area. By understanding these traditional practices, we can make coral reef conservation exponentially more effective. Now, we can't expect fishing communities to reverse climate change, but we can look to them to provide solutions on how to make our reefs more resilient as our oceans warm. Think of it like CPR. Fisher folk are the EMTs that keep the ocean's heart pumping, keeping coral reefs alive. Because once they're gone forever. So, what if we changed the status quo and prioritized fishers' perspectives? What if we leveraged traditional ecological knowledge to manage reef fisheries? What if we looked to fisher folk for solutions on how to manage the resources that they know best? Now, let's go back to that beach in the Philippines. The only reason we were able to save the reef from being eaten alive by the crown of thorns starfish was because of the star fishermen's determination to protect their livelihoods and culture. Now it's our turn to approach global reef conservation with the same spirit of collaboration and empathy as we keep those closest to the sea at the heart of our efforts. So I'll leave you with this. As we are fighting to save our planet, we have to make sure our most valuable soldiers are at the front lines. Saving the oceans isn't just about protecting fish and corals. It's about making sure the sea's biggest advocates have the resources they need to protect their livelihoods, cultures, and home. Thank you.